It's that time, once again, where I gather up all of the custom Chaos Warbands and Space Marine chapters that have been submitted to me by my Patreons and channel members, pick one, and build it. And in this video, I'll be tackling the custom Space Marine chapter known as the Cernachian Wardens, which was submitted to me by Asia Ventura. The Cernachian Wardens are a Space Wolf successor chapter, which have developed a strong connection to the flora and fauna of their native Cernakia. In a nutshell, they're Space Marine Druids with a strong Cornish and Celtic influence. As such, I began with one of the Inner Circle companions from the Dark Angels range. The long robes equipped by these miniatures would work wonderfully to represent their druidic aspects, as well as offering a more impressive silhouette that would mark this model as a lieutenant or a captain. But before this torso could be built upon, it first needed any overt Dark Angel iconography to be removed. So I removed the sword on the chest, but retained the wings around it. The sword would be replaced by something that fit the Cernachian Wardens a little better, and that was of course dead animal bits. I began with a bird skull from the Citadel skull set. The underside of the skull was then flattened somewhat using a combination of my knife and clippers. Once it could fit flat against the chest, I glued it into place before fully assembling the torso. However, before I attached the front belt piece, it first needed its keys and small reliquary to be removed. After clipping them away, the piece was also glued to the torso. The world of Cernakia is home to a predatory stag-like creature that is the planet's apex predator, a creature that the Wardens revere. So, as a nod to this creature, I saw some more bits of dead animals, specifically a pair of antlers from the Sylvaneth Tree Revenant's kit. These first needed to be clipped away from the hair, but once removed and cleaned up, they were then glued to the hanging string. When it came to weapons, I didn't want to simply go for the two-handed sword of the companions, and instead opted for the sword and shield option available to captains and lieutenants. I began with the shield arm sourced from the Blade God Veterans kit, but instead of using the standard shield, this warden would be equipped with a buckler, which was taken from the Dwarf Ironbreakers kit. In order to attach the Blade Guard arm to the dwarf shield, both parts needed to be clipped and flattened until the two pieces aligned better. Once things were lining up, I glued the hand to the shield, but didn't attach it to the arm just yet. To make my painting easier later on, I decided to keep the shield separate from the rest of the model, but when it came to attaching the shield arm to the torso, it did make it easier to do a quick dry fit, just to make sure that the arm was held high enough to hold the shield up. With the left arm in place, my next step was to attach a Blade Guard Veteran sword arm. But first, let's hear from the sponsors of this video, Boot.dev. My background is in software development. I studied at university and spent 10 years working in the industry. And in all that time, one thing that I often found to be a problem was finding resources for learning new things that were both engaging and interesting. The folks at Boot.dev believe that they have the solution for this, and that is to make sure that you're never bored. Boot.dev is an online, self-paced learning platform where you will learn back-end web development from start to finish in the Python and Go programming languages. But the best part is, it feels like a captivating RPG game. If you're like me, you learn best from doing something rather than just reading or watching someone else do it, and that's why Boot.dev has you actually writing the code yourself. And as you're churning out those lines, you'll be earning XP, levels, achievements, and completing quests to get that top spot on the global leaderboard. If you're ever stuck on something, don't worry, because Boots the Bear Wizard is there to help you on your journey. He's an AI that's been trained on each lesson and will help point you in the right direction with a series of guided questions. And you can always see the full solution if you're still scratching your head on a problem. Don't just take my word for it though. Go check it out for yourself and try some of the early challenges and even review their videos and text guides in guest mode completely free. But if you're really wanting to get the best out of Boot.dev, then click my link in the description below and use the code PeteTheWargamer to get 25% off your first payment. Now that's 25% off your first month or your first year, depending on which subscription you choose. So whether you're just looking for something new or you're looking for that new career path, Boot.dev has you covered. Now, let's get back to that Space Marine. Continuing with the Celtic knot designs, I sourced a topper from a Votan Carl. There are a few bits that these kinds of pieces can be found in, but this one was the most ornate and would work well for representing a leader. After comparing it to a regular Primaris pack, I found that both the topper and the pack needed to be clipped down and generally smoothed out of any ridges. Once these had been removed, the topper was sat perfectly atop the backpack. From here, the two were glued together, the pack was glued to the torso, and some regular Blade Guard veteran shoulder pads were placed over the arms. For the extra storage items, these were attached as per usual, but not before removing the more obvious Dark Angel iconography from the holster. By this stage in the build, I felt like something was missing, and that was more dead animal bits. They are perfect for adding just a little extra detail, as well as feeding into the druidic aspects of the Wardens. The first of these was the goat skull from the Citadel's skull set, but in order to make it fit, I first needed to clip away the horns. Once removed, the skull was glued next to the pouches. This was then followed up by a couple of feathers that I clipped away from the Corvus Cabal Warcry set. Once removed, they were also glued to the pouches. And with that, I could focus on the base. After attaching the Warden to a 40mm base, I then wanted to recreate that affinity with nature that this chapter has. So, after dipping into my Sylvaneth bits box once again, I grabbed some Kurnoth Hunter branches. The individual branches were clipped away and cleaned up before being glued around the rock on the base. Now, finally, before painting, I drilled some 1mm holes into the shield hand and the Blade Guard veteran head. Into these, some 1mm wire was superglued so that I could keep a hold of them while I painted. Now, before I show you how I painted this model, if you're enjoying this video, please do consider giving it a like and hitting the subscribe button. It helps me out, and you can ensure you're kept up to date with my latest guides just like this one. Oh, and be sure to turn on notifications, but for now, let's get to the painting. As always, the first step in painting was to apply a primer, and for this I selected some Trench Brown from the Colour Forge. This particular shade was light enough to make layering up those brighter colours a little easier, and the brown would help with those earthy tones. The Cernachian wear a rich green armour, and to recreate this, I began with a base coat of Orc Hide from the Tooth and Coats range. Before application, I mixed a little water into the paint to make it easier to apply. After painting the first layer, I let it dry fully before applying a second coat. This resulted in a much more solid starting colour. For the next few steps, I built upon this base with some ever brighter greens using a glazing technique. The trick here is to create a thin mixture. About 3 parts water to 1 part paint is good for a thin glaze. This mix was painted over the higher points and raised sections of the armour. The thin mixture means it dries quickly and can be built upon over several applications to create a gradient from the darker Orc Hide to the more intense green of Goblinoid Green. These raised areas continue to be picked out with a second glaze of Talisman Green. The same principles and mixture was created as last time, but the area of application was reduced. From here, some Talisman Green and Craven Yellow were mixed to create an even brighter green, but this time around I applied this mixture as an edge highlight. This saw me apply the paint in thin lines along the hard edges of the armour. Combined with the previously created gradients, it helped these details to stand out against the shadows of the darker Orc Hide. This layering and highlighting process helped to lift the details away from the surface and give the model a greater level of depth. The final step in painting the armour was to pick out only the corners and sharpest points with some Craven Yellow, something that I like to call an extreme highlight. With the armour complete, I turned my attention to the inner robe. I wanted a deep magenta for this and began with a base coat of Sword Hilt Burgundy. Over this, I created a glaze of Glistening Gums and used it to pick out the raised folds in the cloth. However, this had desaturated that magenta somewhat, so it was brought back by applying an all-over glaze of Sword Hilt Burgundy. The layer was thin enough to allow the previously applied gradient to still show through, whilst adjusting the colour back towards that rich magenta colour. From here, I could begin with the highlights, first with some thin lines of hot pink, and finally a few small spots of neo pink. For the outer robe, I wanted an earthy brown that would contrast against the richness of the inner robe, and so settled on a base coat of Ancient Forest. Following the base coat, I then moved towards a darker Scorched Brown and mixed up yet another glaze. This time around, I targeted the paint into the recesses and deep folds of the cloak. Here, it created the shadows rather than the highlights, but the concept of layering and gradients remained the same. Following the Scorched Brown, I then highlighted with some Wasteland Brown, and finished off with a few points of Griffon Claw. To paint the leather of the pouches and belt, as well as the branches, I followed a more simpler approach and began with a base coat of Cuirass Leather, which was highlighted with Boar Hide, before being given an extreme highlight of some fur cloak. Another feature of the Cernachian Wardens are their red shoulder pads. However, so that they don't appear too festive, I toned this down to a maroon and base coated them both with Dread Red. The upper 2/3 of each shoulder pad was then steadily glazed with some Asmodeus Red, followed by an initial highlight along the edge of the pad with some Evil Eye Red, and then a few small spots of Rust Orange. To paint the various bones and pieces of parchment, I began with a base coat of Argonaut Skin. This was highlighted with Kronos Flesh, and then again with some small spots of Ares Flesh. Following this, some Dungeonstone Grey was then applied as a base coat across the antlers, tactical rock, and antler stubs. I then highlighted these details with Wizard Grey, followed by some Carcharadon Grey. To paint the segmented sections between the armour, I very carefully base coated them with some Death Reaper. They were then lined with Cold Corpse Blue, with a few small spots of Wolf Grey to finish off. My next task was to tackle the skin, and rather than applying a base coat, my first step was to glaze up from the existing Trench Brown primer. This glaze was performed exactly the same as my earlier applications, but focused on the facial details. This was followed by another glaze of Elven Skin, but this time I reduced the area that I covered. Then a few small spots of Ivory Tusk finished off the skin. When it came to the hair, I opted for a pale ginger, and so began with a base coat of Gyzmo Fur. I then applied my first highlight using Manticore Ochre, and then Cerberus Brown. The head wasn't quite done with though. Just to add that extra little detail, I then painted on some tattoos over the left eye using some thin lines of Cursed Blue. With the head complete, I then turned my attention to the various silver metallic details dotted across the model. These were all base coated with some Dwarven Iron, highlighted with Plate Armor, and then extreme highlighted with Mythril Blade. Continuing with the metallics, all the knotwork and armor trims were base coated with some Overlord Brass, and then highlighted with some Battle Axe Brass. However, a few of these brass details were looking a little flat, so to remedy this, I applied some targeted applications of Battle Mud Wash directly into the recesses around those brass areas. The wash darkened down these recesses, helping to lift the surrounding details. With the metallics complete, I changed out my paint water and turned my attention to the small leaves. These were base coated with Wyvern Green, highlighted with Emerald Green, before being finished off with a few small spots of Ethereal Green. My final task in painting this model was to add another detail to the Cernachian Wardens, their amber eyes. So, the eyes and remaining gems were first base coated with Ivory Tusk, before being coated with a mixture of orange and yellow glazes. Mixing these two colours helped to create a closer approximation to the desired amber. Finally, the top right corner of the shield gem was given a small line of Ivory Tusk to create that reflective effect. At this point, the head and shield could be removed from their holders, cleaned up with a knife, and then glued to the rest of the miniature. The remaining areas of the base were then coated with some dark, earthy texture paste and allowed to dry fully for several hours. Once dried, it was given a wash with Oblivion and Black to help give the surface a little more definition. The rim of the base was then painted with Doom Death Black, and some various gamer grass tufts were dotted about the base to complete that grassy moorland effect. And with that, I was left with this. And here we have the finished Cernachian Warden, as submitted by one of my Patreon supporters, Asa Ventura, and this model will be making its way to them very shortly. If you would like to be in for a chance to have your own miniature idea created by me and sent to you, then all you need to do is either become a Patreon supporter or channel member using the links below. There you'll find a link to a form that will allow you to submit your idea to me. In addition to your submission, you will also get access to sneak peeks, early and ad-free videos, plus some exclusive merchandise, and you'll be helping to keep this channel going. Speaking of my supporters, let me just say a huge thank you to everyone who already helps me out. In particular, my Pouch of Dead Animal Bits tier and above supporters, who are Andrew Console, Axel Jonsson, Berserker, Bits of Wargaming, Daniel Dowling, Gabe Benavides, Hugh Wright, Ian, Ilniro Galeri, Immaterial Creations, Maciej Savitsky, Matt Brower, Molly Mork, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Nathan, Nima, Pale Juice, Ryan Little, Splinkus, Swedsman, Tim, and Tom Hay-Smith. And my Sergeant level channel members who are Lloyd Davis, Trooper Geo, Mr. Jared Hess 95, David, John Gibbs, The Sire Acquired, Philip Poyer, Nerdington Bates, Mark Taylor, and Whale Tussler. So, until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.